Hello race fans, it's your buddy Yeti, and I would like to discuss something today that I've often discussed before, and that is video games losing their identity. It's come to my attention again because on various message boards, and I won't mention specific ones, but I again see people squabbling over the conflicting ideas of what should and shouldn't be in a Forza Motorsport game. Now, my personal favorite illustration for this is the Dirt games. Now, the Dirt series has been developed by Codemasters. It has eventually become owned by EA, and Codemasters had developed the most recent, as of this recording, WRC, World Rally Championship game. Now, that was released in 2023, and then in 2024, they had a DLC update for it. But since then, more recently, we have found that they will not be developing the WRC games in the future, that apparently EA has made the decision to suspend development of all rally racing games. Now, as of this recording, I don't know the official reason for why EA made this decision, but if I was to wager a guess, it would be that they're just not seeing the sales and the return on their investment that they would like and expect from these games. I've been kind of wondering if this has anything to do with the kind of seemingly lost direction that they've had with their Dirt games as of late. After the release of Dirt 5, I was very vocal on their message boards on their Facebook page about my thoughts and feelings on what they ended up making Dirt 5 into, to the point where Codemasters seemed to be kind of irritated with me and made it so that I couldn't comment on their posts anymore. Now, this was really disappointing for me because their games is something that I have long been a fan of and passionate about, which is why I was vocal about my thoughts and feelings on their product. Now, I don't know, maybe my criticism looked to them like I was just trolling, but that's not the case at all. I felt a little bit like stabbed in the back, betrayed, however you want to describe it, as a longtime fan of their products. But, maybe they made it so I couldn't comment anymore because they thought I was just trolling. Although I'm afraid that probably the more realistic possibility is that they just didn't want the negative attention. I don't want to say press or publicity, but negative feedback. Now, what I've been recommending on Forza Motorsport boards, and to Turn 10 in particular, is that Turn 10 needs to figure out exactly what a Forza Motorsport is and rigidly commit to being that and excelling at that instead of trying to be something for everybody. And this brings me to my use of Dirt as an illustration because of the fact that the franchise has been all over the place over the years and seems to have completely lost their way. The developers seem to have no idea what a Dirt is or should be. Now, before Dirt was Dirt, Dirt was Colin McRae Rally. Now, for those that weren't there at the time, or maybe were but didn't play the games, or just for whatever reason aren't familiar, allow me to explain. So we begin in 1998 with Colin McRae Rally. That was then followed up with Colin McRae Rally 2.0, Colin McRae Rally 3, Colin McRae Rally 4, and then Colin McRae Rally 2005. So there we had a trend of 5 games in a row, rally, 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 rally. Now, what does that have to do with Dirt? Well, they continued with the Colin McRae series, but they weren't Colin McRae Rally anymore. They followed up 2005 with Colin McRae Dirt. Now, the change here isn't just the name following Colin McRae, it's what the game focused on. Whereas the first 5 games in the series were exclusively about rally racing, Dirt diversified it a bit more. It still had plenty of rally racing in it, but also mixed it up with some other types of off-roady type racing series, like championship off-road racing, different stuff. Now, I was a really massive fan of the original Colin McRae Dirts. I still really enjoy rally racing, but I also appreciated all the other types of off-roady stuff that they added to it as well. Sadly, Colin McRae, who the game series was named after up to this point, had passed away during the same year that the first Colin McRae Dirt was released. It was followed up by Colin McRae Dirt 2, which would end up being the last in the series to carry his name. Now, the first Colin McRae Dirt had already deviated a bit from their series roots in pure rally racing. Dirt 2, or shall I say Colin McRae Dirt 2, had deviated a little bit farther. To me, I would describe it as more X Gamesy. It still had rally and all that, but the presentation of it, the feel of it, got a little bit more what I would describe as X Gamesy. And they added some stadium races, which felt like it would be directly out of an X Games kind of a thing. At the same time, though, Dirt 2 seemed to also establish a little bit of a legitimacy by having several real-world rally drivers involved in it, including Ken Block, Travis Pastrana, Tanner Faust, Dave Mira, and this guy, I'm not going to butcher his name by trying to pronounce it. But then came Dirt 3, which was the first in the franchise's history to drop the Colin McRae name. Dirt 3 had particularly deviated even farther from the series roots by getting even more deep into the X Games stuff and more away from the rally roots of it, and then adding other fluff like Gymkhana. Now, at this point, I wasn't a fan of the direction that I could see the games clearly taking. I had personally wanted more racing and less doing donuts around flagpoles and whatnot. Now, I appreciate that there's people that enjoy the Gymkhana stuff, that love to watch those videos, but I wasn't personally a fan, and I felt that regardless of whether or not I was a fan, that it was just deviating a bit too far from where the series originally started. But I'm not going to spend too much time crapping all over Gymkhana out of respect for the late Ken Block. While I'm not a fan of the Gymkhana stuff in particular, I do greatly respect Ken Block as a driver. He was amazing behind the wheel of like pretty much anything that had an engine on it. But my take on it and what I had expressed in various places online, including to Codemasters, is that yes, I get that there are people that enjoy this. There is a market for this, for the Gymkhana and all the other more silly, less motorsportsy fluff, but make it its own standalone game instead of making Dirt into just that stuff. Well, as it would happen to turn out, that's exactly what Codemasters did. The very next game in the franchise was Dirt Showdown, which deviated completely from the regular racing stuff and did, well, as you can see, I guess, in the clip here, a bunch of ridiculous nonsense. Now, I avoided this like the plague, but I, again, appreciate that there are people that do enjoy this sort of thing, and they made this game for those people that enjoy that sort of thing. But, fortunately, this time they took the correct approach and made it its own separate game instead of making a mainline Dirt game into this nonsense. So at this point I'm thinking, cool, they made all this junk its own separate game. Now all I need is for them to make the next core Dirt game an actual proper racing game and not have the Gymkhana and the jumping through flaming hoops and the fireworks and all that crap. Well, as it turns out, keeping with their trend of heading in the right direction, they followed up Dirt Showdown with Dirt Rally, which was an excellent dedicated rally game, going back to what the series started with in the first place. Once again remaining on the right track, they then follow that up with Dirt 4. Now, unlike the direction they were trending in with the previous series of Dirt games, Dirt 4 did deviate from Dirt Rally a little bit in that it leaned a little bit less simulation-y, a little bit more forgiving, but still remained dedicated to rally racing and rallycross. So even though it went in a slightly different direction from the previous Dirt Rally, it still remained focused on what the series began with in the first place, instead of the X Games and Gymkhana and all that, goofy nonsense. Now, following Dirt 4, Codemasters again continued on the right track, this time with Dirt Rally 2.0. Now, even though this has been out for some years now as of this recording, it still remains to this day popular with fans of rally racing games. Even with there being a bunch of officially licensed WRC games from an alternative developer available on the market, a lot of rally game fans remain fiercely loyal to specifically Codemasters Dirt Rally 2. Now, the reason that I've been saying that the last few games here have been on the right track for Codemasters is the fact that the series, back before it was even Dirt in the first place, was exclusively Rally. Rally was the roots of the series. But I felt that if they want to diversify and do other things, that's fine. Make separate, spin-off franchises instead of just the mainline games being repurposed as something totally different. And they've done that with Dirt Showdown being just all the silly fluff, nonsense, goofy stuff, and then a dedicated rally game with Rally right there in the name. And then in between we had Dirt 4, which, even though it wasn't specifically Dirt Rally, it went back to the roots of what the series was. And then this happened. So to kind of quickly sum everything up to this point, the series began with 5 consecutive rally racing games, followed by the first Dirt game, which was largely rally, but assorted other realistic-ish or real racing series as well, followed by Dirt 2 and Dirt 3, which were at least somewhat in line with that, but increasingly deviating from that, followed by Dirt Showdown, which was kind of like a spin-off series, although it didn't end up being a series. It was just a one-off title, but should have been a series that should have included this next game, where it was just all the other silly nonsense and not the actual motorsports. Followed by Dirt Rally, an excellent, outstanding rally game, followed by Dirt 4, which was more of what the series began with, followed by Dirt Rally 2, which was an even better, more outstanding rally game. So after we had Codemasters on the right track for a handful of games in a row, they completely derailed altogether and flew off a cliff. I don't know if you call Dirt 5 a complete 180, or maybe it's a hard right. Whatever it was, it completely went off in a totally different direction. A direction more along the lines of where Dirt 3 was sort of headed, more in line with maybe Dirt Showdown. And I don't mind that they had a Dirt Showdown, as long as it wasn't this Dirt 3, 4, 5, whatever, because when you slap a label like that on there, people would logically expect it to be in line or more or less in line with what the previous games in that series was like, not a complete deviation from that. I'll use the example of sports games. You might want a football game, maybe you might want a basketball game, or a hockey or a baseball game, and that's perfectly fine. There's a market for all those things. But what wouldn't be okay is to make, say, a women's tennis game and slap the Madden NFL name on it. Yeah, somebody might want a tennis game, but they're not going to buy something with the name Madden expecting it to be a tennis game. They're going to expect it to be a football game. Because for decades now, that's what the series has always been. So what exactly is my problem with Dirt 5? Well, had it not been labeled Dirt 5, had it been labeled something else, like, say, Dirt Showdown 2, or maybe a new spin-off altogether, I call it, Dirt Nitro or something, that probably would have been perfectly fine for me. But calling it Dirt 5, it implies to the person getting it that it is kind of along the lines, more or less, of what Dirt 1, 2, 3, and 4 were, except it's not in line with that. It's something totally different. And what exactly is different about it? Well, almost everything. It went from a more tame, realistic-ish, semi-serious racing game to being just a bunch of people coked up on you know, I don't know, jacked up on Mountain Dew and heroin, or I don't know, whatever, hopping into vehicles and, you know, spray painting them with like really vulgar colors and just banging around like lunatics. Everything about the game is really loud. Not just audio, but I'm talking visually to look at it. You can mute your TV and still hear the game just because of all the vulgarity assaulting your eyes from the screen. All the logos and menu graphics, the menus themselves, the fonts, the liveries painted on the cars, the signs along the stages, everything is just barfed all over with fruity pebbles. It's the most loud game I've ever seen, probably. If I was to describe the game's color palette, I would say that it would be anything that starts with words like neon or flaming or screaming, atomic. So like neon green, atomic yellow, screaming pink, blazing purple. Now, I didn't even particularly care for any of the music in the game, although in fairness, that's personal preference. I'm sure there's people that love the soundtrack. It just didn't really work for me, and I actually ended up muting the soundtrack altogether. But I will hold the voice work against it. They got, for whatever reason, Donut Media. And before anybody gets offended and gets mad at me, I know Donut Media is successful and popular and has a lot of listeners or viewers, whatever they do. I'm not very familiar with their work. I just kind of know of them. I didn't really get into their stuff. And I appreciate that there's people that like that and that they have an appeal. I just don't know that it was the right fit for this particular game. Every single solitary line of dialogue from start to finish in the entire game was just inane drivel. Not a single solitary line of dialogue contributed to the game in a positive way, in any conceivable way. It was basically just there to be like, look kids, we've got Donut Media. So, I don't know, for example, say you're starting into a new event type that you haven't done before. They had one called like Stampede or something, and the dialogue is just like them really high on weed. And in fairness, okay, probably not, but it's what it kind of seemed like to me. It's like, I don't know, a stoner going on, like, whoa, man, this is radical, dude. It's like Stampede, yo. It's a stampede, man. All these vehicles just stampeding, dude. I don't know, it got to the point, like, I just couldn't stand to listen to it anymore. It felt like I lost brain cells every time I listened to this drivel. Now, I already said at one point I muted the music. I couldn't stand to listen to that anymore. I didn't quite completely mute the audio just in case at some point there was something worth mentioning, but I did turn it way down just to try to minimize the damage to my brain. But this is a racing game, and it had, I guess you could call all of it racing, but not a single race series in the entire game in any way represented any real motorsports. Past games in the franchise, of course, Rally was a big feature. They had some Rally Cross, they did some other off-roady type racing series, but then here comes Dirt 5 that has nothing in any way resembling real motorsports. And that right there brings me to a big gripe leading up to the release of the game, looking at some of the promotional stuff that they had posted on social media. Now, the promotional stuff that they had posted, the videos that I had seen, were similarly like nonsensical, completely non-serious, goofy drivel like what the game ended up actually being. Like one of them that comes to mind was boasting that they had Donut Media, and it had people from Donut Media talking about how excited they were to be a part of the game. This video had like really crappy like cartoon caricatures of those people, and they're not saying anything any more meaningful than anything that they said in the game. It was just like, oh, what, whoa, and I was like, what? And I'm like, whoa, and I'm like, who is this for? But one of the videos was boasting that the game was, as they described it, a real racing game for real racing fans. And that really chapped my behind, because nothing could have been farther from the truth. It's like if you made a racing game trying to appeal to people that have absolutely no shred of interest in a racing game. This real racing game for real racing fans was targeted at people that would never in real life go to an actual race. But not only do I feel that all this was a complete misfire, but it was also by far the buggiest game I've ever got from Codemasters. And I've played an awful lot of their games up to that point. I ran into more bugs in the first 5 or 10 minutes of playing the game than I did in all their other games I've played combined, start to finish. The game was made out of bugs. And I'm not exaggerating here. It'd be easier to list the few things that actually worked right than it would be to list all the things that were wrong with it. Now, in fairness, I played it on day one. Surely, eventually, over time, they patched a lot of this stuff. But, you know, other games will come out and they'll have bugs, and like the first patch will fix a lot of it. Not this one. They actually patched bugs into the game. Now, I get how that might sound like a joke or an exaggeration, but it's not. Specifically, the game had different graphic modes options. You could do, I think, what they call a quality mode, where you could focus on sharper image quality, you know, more detail, or you could do a performance mode that focused less on resolution and more on frame rate. Now, I started playing it on the quality mode, trying to focus on like richer visuals, and it looked good enough to me. It was perfectly playable to me right up until the first patch came out. When that patch came out, suddenly every single race event I tried to start would not start. It completely froze the game. So you know how like it's a common thing in most racing games to have like a pre-race countdown, 3, 2, 1, go, or some variation thereof. Well, Dirt 5 did the same thing, and every time it got down to 1, I think it was, maybe it was 2, but I'm pretty sure it was 1, it would freeze every time. Every single time it did this, I had to like close the game out back to the dashboard, reload it, try that event again or try another one. It didn't matter. It always froze when it got to 1. So it was literally unplayable. And I even went back and tried it on events I've already done up to that point, and even those experienced the same problem. It would get down to 1 on the countdown and then it would freeze. I reached out to Codemasters with my problem, looking for them to give me some kind of a solution to work around something to make the game playable for me, and I got nothing. I had to find my own workaround, and what I eventually found was if I switched the graphic setting to performance, then suddenly it wouldn't freeze. But what did they do that made it so that it used to work and then suddenly couldn't work? Now, I didn't mean to spend as much time as I did on just specifically Dirt 5, but I guess the point of it all was to try to illustrate just how much of a shift, a sudden shift, this one single game made from what the previous ones had been doing. Now, my understanding of it is after Dirt 5, the next game that they were going to develop was going to be another Dirt Rally, and that I'm sure would have been outstanding, but then they ended up acquiring the WRC license, and from my understanding, what was going to be the new Dirt Rally ended up being repurposed as the new WRC. So I think I've already touched on this before, but that came out in 2023 as EA Sports WRC, and then a year later in 2024 it had an expansion to add some 2024 content. But then my understanding of it is that EA after that had shelved all development of rally games for the foreseeable future, and of course again EA owns Codemasters. So I feel like looking over recapping kind of the entire history of this franchise, at first, it knew exactly what it was. It had 5 games in a row of dedicated rally games. Then when it became Dirt, it diversified a bit. It still kept a lot of the rally stuff, but also did other off-roady stuff as well. Then Dirt 2 and 3 kind of kept some of that, but a little bit less over time. Then we had Dirt Showdown, which was something completely different, off the wall, followed by Dirt Rally, which was an excellent rally game, which is where the series began in the first place, followed by Dirt 4, which took the mainline Dirt games back to where the games began in the first place, followed by Dirt Rally 2, which was again an outstanding rally game and where the series began, but then completely derailed. I don't know if you call it 180, maybe a 90 hard right, whatever, with Dirt 5. So to me, it felt like the series began knowing what it was, then over time had no idea what it was or should be, or where it should be going. But of course, it's not just the Dirt series. I just picked on Dirt for quite a while because I felt that they were perhaps the best, most obvious illustration of my point. But another really good example that comes to mind is the Project Cars games. Now, I guess I would say that I was a big fan of Project Cars, 1 and 2 anyway. I say I guess because the first one, for the most part, I was really impressed with the product. Did a lot of really cool stuff, but I did have some major problems with it as well, unfortunately. Now, I don't want to deviate and spend too much time on that, but like a couple of examples that come to mind is one, I had some major frame rate issues on Xbox. Specifically, sometimes I'd hop on there and I'm not exaggerating here at all. I know it'll sound like it, but I'm not. Single-digit frame rates. Now, looking back, I think a lot of that had to do with using the resume function. So if I remember correctly, I think I could get around a lot of that by just starting the game fresh instead of relying on the resume function. But by far, the worst and most egregious thing that happened to me was the game completely corrupting my save file. This was basically a consequence of the developers having no idea how save files should work. When I play racing games, I like to save a lot of my race replays so I can go back later and view them and make video clips with them. Well, it turns out apparently something about the way it lumps like all the save data together, if the file exceeds a certain size, it'll end up corrupted and will be completely unusable. It would only get to such bloated sizes if you saved a lot of race replays or some long race replays. The part that maybe aggravates me even more about this is I looked it up online and the developers were aware of this but didn't say anything. So they knew it was a problem but let players continue to do it anyways and didn't even have like a patch that may, or something that had some kind of like an in-game notification like, hey, by the way, don't save too many game saves or race replay saves or something. Nothing. Never said a word. But I don't want to spend too much time on all that. What I'm focusing on here is Project Cars 1 and 2 for a certain type of product. More specifically, a kind of like a, more or less a racing sim. The hardcore sim guys that play like iRacing or whatever, they might still look down on it as not being a pure sim. I don't know. I haven't really got to ever play iRacing myself. But compared to other racing games, including even Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport, it seemed to be more simulation-y even than those. And Project Cars was on game consoles, Xbox, PlayStation, which didn't have access to certain things like R-Factor or iRacing. So for game consoles, it was about as simulation-y as you had available for you. But they went from that, and all of a sudden Project Cars 3 is something totally different. Now, I avoided Project Cars 3 for a long time because I was aware from what they had said, from what I read about it, I knew it was something totally different from the direction 1 and 2 went. But I did eventually get Project Cars 3 and played it quite a bit. And I would describe it as being more along the lines of maybe, I don't know, like a Need for Speed Shift. And that's perfectly fine. I even played Need for Speed Shift long before that. I think the biggest problem here, though, was that they called it Project Cars 3, with it being something completely different from what Project Cars 1 and 2 were. I have no problem with them making something totally different. I play all kinds of different things. Heck, I even like Mario Kart. If you want to go in a different direction and make something completely different, that's fine, but I think call it something completely different. Don't call it Project Cars 3, because then a player like myself would expect it to be along the lines of Project Cars 1 and 2, not something completely different. Now, with the Forza franchise, I feel like the uncertainty about what it should be isn't as obvious. Some of the mistakes made with the other franchises I've discussed earlier weren't made with the Forza franchise. With the Dirt franchise and the Project Cars franchise, the decision to go in a different direction and make a different type of racing game weren't handled very well, in that they were given the same name that they were given to like the previously established games instead of their own separate, say, spin-off series or whatever. The Forza franchise didn't make that mistake. The Forza Motorsport games continued to be Forza Motorsport games, more or less along the lines of what we would expect them to be. And then when they made an open world, more casual-ish kind of racing game, they made it a separate standalone series that became Forza Horizon. And then they even dabbled with a mobile game that was, again, something totally different. And what was that called? Ah, yes, Forza Street. But people that have been playing the Forza Motorsport games for a long time now, if they've played most or all of them and spent any significant amount of time in any of them, may have noticed some like different directions with some of the design choices over the different iterations of the game. As an example, looking back to when I played Forza Motorsport 2, the way I remember it is that races were like, say, 8 or 10 laps. Now, most of the racing games that I've played have been a lot shorter, like 2 or 3 laps maybe tops. But I remember Forza Motorsport 2 having longer races, like I say, 5 or 10 or 8 or 10 maybe laps, depending on the track. Now, I kind of like that because it leaned a little bit closer to what would be more realistic. If you watch a real-world race, nobody races 2 or 3 laps. I mean, could you imagine a NASCAR race, an IndyCar race, a Formula One race that's only 2 or 3 laps? But at the same time, video games, people play when they can. They can't always dedicate several hours at a time. So something like 5, 6, 8, 10 laps might be more realistic. But as near as I could tell, the ADD crowd that didn't have the attention span or the patience for 8 or 10 laps must have whined enough on message boards and got their way, because it seemed like when you got into Forza 3 and 4 that they got shorter. Well, that's great for the more casual players that just want to hop in and fart around for a little bit and move on to some other game. But folks like me that are diehard racing fans appreciated those longer semi-realistic race distances. Not to mention, if you're going to start farther back in the pack and be expected to try to work your way to the front within 2 or 3 laps, you're going to have to be either, on a lower AI difficulty so you can breeze by everybody, or be really aggressive and play bumper cars, which isn't professional, which would get you in trouble in real motorsports. But conversely, with longer races, 7, 8, 10, 12 laps, we have time to race more clean and professional. So what we had here is a conflict of interest. Some of us wanting one thing, some of us wanting something polar opposite of that. Well, I guess the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so all the people that weren't happy with the longer races, crying and complaining on the message boards, got their way. So Turn 10, the developers of Forza, shifted directions with it towards a shorter race to make those whiners happy. Now, I had suggested, argued, however you want to put it, that what I think would be a brilliant solution, the game already had a lot of options available for different assists and things anyway, have an option for people to choose if they want longer or shorter races. That way everybody wins. Well, fortunately, I forget which Forza Motorsport it was, but eventually they actually did exactly that. But over the years, there's been a lot of other little subtle-ish things that have changed with the games over time. I assume based on feedback from players, but again, we all want different conflicting things. Another example that came to mind was with the narrator, I guess you could call it that, in the earlier Xbox 360 generation games. He had like an elegant sophistication about his delivery. But I don't know, maybe some people felt that he was too dry and stuffy and they wanted something maybe a little bit more casual and lively. By the time we got into the Xbox One generation of Forza games, that type of narrator was gone. And specifically, I think of Forza Motorsport 7 had what I referred to as Dude Bro. I guess whenever I hear him talk, what I kind of imagine in my head is like one of those stereotypical like 80s surfer dudes. Now, I don't know who he was for, but he definitely wasn't for me. I miss the more elegant speaker from the earlier games. Well, I've been saying elegant, maybe I should say eloquent. Now, for years, we'd been asking for night and rain. In Forza Motorsport 6, we finally got that, but it was almost like they were spiteful about it. If we had a race that was at night, oh my God, was it dark. And if you never played Forza Motorsport 6, ask anybody about the rain. Most other racing games, if they have rain, it's just like a shiny, wet-looking texture and a decrease in grip. Oh no, not Forza Motorsport 6. They had pools of water. I mean, three-dimensional, fully rendered, polygon model pools of water. And it's not like it would be even all the way across the track. No, it'll pool on the side of the track or off the side of the track and maybe onto that part of the track a little bit. And what happens when you hit the puddle with one side of your car, one or two tires hits it, but not the opposite side of the car, you are spinning around. It's almost like they were like, oh, you want night, you want rain, oh boy, you asked for it, you are going to get it. But I guess I have to assume that they got an awful lot of complaints about it being maybe a little overboard with the water, because by Forza Motorsport 7, they had a more traditional wet track and not the big pools of water, as I recall. I know in the latest Forza game, the 8th one, although it's not called Forza Motorsport 8, we definitely do not have the lakes of water on the track anymore. Now, another big change I'd seen since the 360 generation going into the Xbox One generation was with how much money we get and how much cars cost. The way I remember it on Xbox 360 with Forza Motorsport 2, 3, and 4, cars cost a lot more, and it took a lot of time to get the money to get the more expensive cars, more along the lines of Gran Turismo. Now, those of us like myself that put hundreds of hours willingly into the Forza games, that gave us something to work towards over time. But I have to assume that the more casual players that wanted to hop in, fool around with it for 5 or 10 hours at tops and move on, whined about the grind, that it was taking too long to get the cars that they wanted. Now, I felt like if racing in a racing game feels like a grind to you, then maybe racing isn't the right type of game for you. But seemingly, Turn 10 must have listened to those complaints, because eventually, I forget if it was by Forza Motorsport 5 or 6, but at one point, the prices on the most expensive cars come down a lot compared to what they would have been in earlier games, and the amount of money thrown at us increased. I remember specifically in my case with Forza Motorsport 5, I got to the point where I had every car in the game at least once, maybe multiple iterations of several of them, and I had literally hundreds of millions of in-game credits with nothing to do with it. Now, one of the big changes I'd seen that I wasn't very happy with over the years is with driver aids. Now, the way I remember it when I started playing Forza Motorsport 2, which was the first in the series for me, I was getting into something that leaned more towards the more realistic end of the spectrum, but I was used to more arcadey stuff like, say, Burnout or Need for Speed or Ridge Racer. But that's where the driver aids come in, and Forza offered an awful lot of driver aids: traction control, anti-lock brakes, I think steering assist, I forget what all of them were, to help ease you into it. Now, if you wanted to, you could make the game easier for you by leaving all the driver aids on, or you could make it a little bit more difficult and, in my opinion, more satisfying to drive by turning off the driver aids. And the game would reward you for doing so by giving you a percentage increase in race winnings for doing so. So the more driver aids you turn off, the more you earn after you complete a race. In more recent history, that changed, and by Forza Motorsport 7, I think, if I remember correctly, it got to the point where you didn't get extra money for turning off driver aids. Rather, they had stupid, I can't remember if they were perk cards or what they called them, but you could use them so many times and you got a bonus for completing certain objectives. I remember at one point reading that their philosophy on this change from where they used to reward us by extra earnings for extra difficulty was that they didn't want to penalize players for not turning off the driver aids. Now, I didn't look at it as players using driver aids being penalized for doing so, but rather people being rewarded for not using driver aids. So the way I looked at it, if you used all the driver aids, you got the regular full payout. And then if you had a player that turned off the racing line and traction control, etc., then they got a bonus reward for doing so. In the latest iteration of Forza Motorsport to come out in 2023, it's technically the 8th game, but they don't call it that. The way that it works with the earnings and the driver aids is they've lumped them together in different rule categories, and the harder rule category you choose to race in, the higher extra bonus you get. But unfortunately, it's predetermined groups of aids are lumped together. You can't pick and choose which ones you feel comfortable with, which ones you want, which ones you don't. So let's say you want to turn off everything, but have the option to rewind in case you're 17 laps into a race and suddenly the AI does something really stupid and ruins the whole thing for you. Well, that's not an option. Now it's like all or nothing. If you want to have an option to rewind, you got to use one of the basic difficulty settings. You can't turn off all the driver aids, but still have the option to rewind. Without spending too much more time going into too much more detail, my concern is that everybody wants something different out of Forza, and they often conflict with each other. And what I feel is that Turn 10 needs to decide this is exactly what a Forza Motorsport game is, and rigidly stick to that. Now, let me clarify, by that I don't mean that they shouldn't ever change in any way, that it should be stagnant and stay the same. I just mean that there's certain things that should be foundational for what a Forza game is, and then build on top of that, rather than tweaking and adjusting and adding here and then taking away here. Do we want it to be longer? Do we want it to be shorter? Do we want it to be easier? Do we want it to be harder? More realistic, less realistic, more money, less money, etc., etc., etc. Come up with like a specific definition. This is what a Forza Motorsport game is, and then stick to that. Otherwise, you end up with an identity crisis, and people don't really know when they go into the next game what to expect exactly from it. And if they go into each game trying to be something for everybody, trying to make everybody happy, like with everybody's wants and desires conflicting with each other, you're going to be kind of a jack of all trades, mediocre at a lot of things, but an expert at none of them. Instead, I feel like they should etch in stone exactly what it should be, and focus on excelling at being great at exactly that.